You are listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I am your host, Celine Yeager. Each week, I bring you advice from athletes, scientists, researchers, and other experts to help you feel and perform your best, no matter what your hormones are doing. This show is a production of Live Feisty Media. Hello, strong, feisty women. I hope you all are well. So, like maybe some of you out there, I went through a little experimental phase in college. Smoked some pot, which I never really did take to. As much as I hate to admit it, I tried cocaine once. Yes, cocaine. It was the 80s. And I was like, you must never, ever, 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 and I mean ever do that again, like cocaine. I want to be the usual amped up me just on cocaine. I mean, what was I thinking? Anyway, I could really see why people had so many serious problems with it at that time. I also dabbled a little in psychedelics, which I actually very much enjoyed. I liked watching the trees dance and feeling like I was Dorothy in Oz. But I only took them a couple of times because they lasted way too long. And I figured I didn't want to tempt fate and have a bad experience. And then after that point, honestly, I never really thought about any of it again until I was about 46 and found myself waking up, pouring sweat, and staring into the darkness, feeling like the world was crushing down on me at 3 a.m. every night. Then I got some CBD, THC tincture, cannabis tincture, and it really did help. More recently, my friend and sometimes mountain bike race teammate, world champion Rebecca Rush, was going through crippling depression following a concussion, and what finally pulled her out was psychedelic assisted therapy. We did a podcast series called Brainstorm, and we talked about her experience there. And, interviewing her therapist was extremely eye opening into how these molecules really work and their potential for help in healing that goes way beyond any of the recreational tripping sort of experiences that we have been kind of conditioned to think of them in the context of. Rebecca also turned me on to a neuroscientist named Dr. Grace Blest-Hopley, who has been researching cannabis, cannabinoids, and psychedelics for the past 12 years or so, and is the founder of Hystelica, which is a community focused on understanding women's biology specifically for safe and effective psychedelic use. Grace believes from the research that psychedelics hold a whole lot of potential benefits, especially for menopausal women. And I knew I had to have her on. And wow, I'm glad I did. As you'll hear, she is incredibly knowledgeable and eloquent about cannabinoids, psychedelics, trauma, brain function, and the menopause transition. And importantly, how the possibilities are really quite exciting. I admit I left this conversation not knowing exactly what it all means or what to recommend, if I'd recommend anything, because as we talk about, there's all kinds of cans of worms potentially in here with logistics and legality and safety and all of that, and we get into all of it. But there's also just so much we have yet to learn about all of this. And when you consider how long human beings have been using psychedelics and other plant medicines and plants for medicine for forever, boy, there's just a lot of possibility out there. So sit back, buckle up. This one is a ride through the mind, so to speak. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. All right, before we get to it, give us a follow at Feisty Menopause on Instagram and Facebook. Join our private Hit Play Not Pause Facebook group where we got about 36,000 women helping each other out 24/7. And head into those show notes and sign up for my free weekly Feisty 40 Plus newsletter. Also, head over to feistymenopause.com and check out our full suite of courses that we have now on demand. That includes Navigate Menopause and Strong, which is our strength training course. They're all in there. Check them out. And thank you, as always, for the kind reviews and 5-star ratings that continue to come in. They mean the world to me. Very quickly before we get to it, if you have not checked out our sponsor, Phosis, and their incredible skincare products, which are truly like none I have ever used, I highly encourage you to give them a try. They are so very, very good. So thank you, Phosis, for your support and for making my skin look and feel better than I actually thought it could. All right, enough of me. Let's have a few words about those awesome sponsors and get on with the show. All right, Grace, welcome to the show. And this is a conversation. It might feel a little far afield for my hip play not pause, active women's audience, etc. But it really, really isn't. Especially because the way I found you was through Rebecca Rush, who I've had on the show. I've raced with, I helped write her memoir, etc. And her life changed dramatically when she got a traumatic brain injury in a bike crash. It might be going on 4 years already. It's definitely 3 years. And one of the things that brought her back to feeling much more like herself with psychedelic assisted therapy, which took her a while to find. And then once we started digging into the research on that, I'm like, oh, there's stuff there. And then I sat in on a webinar where you were talking about menopause, and I thought, well, there's trauma and a lot of inflammation, and things are changing, and women lose sense of self. And it just seemed like, wow, there's a lot to talk about here. So I'm going to try to steer it. I have questions in every direction possible.
Excellent. Well, I'm really glad to be here and talk about it. I agree with you. It's such a fascinating area. We are standing at the beginning of the kind of discovery journey of what psychedelic substances can do and how they can help with restoring brain health and potentially addressing certain indications, particularly in women. But from what we know now, I believe that there's a huge amount of potential, particularly in the area of women's health. So I'm excited to talk to you about it today.
How did you get here? In the big picture, because I say you have a PhD in neurochemical and neurofunctional effects of cannabinoids, and you also do education on the effects of psychedelics on female biology, and you serve as a member of the Reserve Armed Forces. So I'm just like, wow, this woman has so much going on.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I'm one of those human beings who really struggles to not permanently be doing something. My idea of a relaxing, weekend at home is to completely reorganize the entire wardrobe or something. So it stems very much from a personal need to be doing things. But for me, it's felt like quite a natural journey. As you say, I started my academic career largely looking at cannabis and cannabinoids, and I'm really looking at adolescent brains and how the brain develops, and cannabinoids could be interacting with this process in a negative way. But through that research, I was really exposed to what has now become a vastly expanding and legitimate field of research around plant medicines. So, starting off with the cannabis plant, was a good place for me to kind of see how these mechanisms might not all be bad, and what we're told in the media and what we've often been fed around these substances is not really true, and it's largely to do with more political structures, political and cultural structures, and not really the science. But I quite quickly moved on from psychedelic science, from cannabinoid-based science into psychedelic science, just because I was really exposed to a lot of the research that was going on while I was doing my PhD. And once you start to see the kind of vast mechanisms that these substances have, and the real immediate and impactful potential that these substances have in terms of treating mental health disorders, I was completely and utterly fascinated. So I really started to develop my knowledge set around psychedelics and moving my research interests in that way. Now, to come to why I ended up in the military, well, after finishing my PhD, I really enjoyed that experience. But one thing that I think PhDs don't get a lot of, and sadly women sometimes don't get a lot of, is experience in leadership positions, experience managing teams and leading teams, often in quite stressful situations. And my sort of desire to get up and do stuff combined with that led me to pursue a career as a reserve army officer. And it was in that position the realities of the biology of being a woman really came to head in terms of standing next to a 6-foot bloke with the same weight on your back, trying to run up the same hill. Suddenly, made you think a bit harder about what those differences might be. And once it came to things like understanding our hormones and understanding how our menstrual cycle and how our life transitions are different, for me, then that's when I really had a light bulb moment, and I realized that we needed to understand women's biology in the context of so many things we do, whether that be exercise, whether that be medical treatments, whether that be the development of disease itself, let alone the extremely specific things in terms of menstrual cycle and menopause. So once I had all these things sort of out on my table, understanding how female biology was affecting psychedelic use and how psychedelic use was affecting female biology was really a very natural place for me to start kind of flourishing in terms of my next project and my next research, which I've done in the form of founding Hystelica, which is a research group dedicated specifically to understanding what those intersections are between women's biology and psychedelics.
Wow. I just love every word that just came out of your mouth.
Yeah.
Have you, I 100% want to go into psychedelics. I am curious how much space you or how much time you were in the cannabinoid space, because that is an area, unlike psychedelics, where I have seen research in the Menopause journal. Let's say it's become mainstream enough that you're seeing it talked about pretty openly, and a lot of women are willing to say, yes, I use THC tinctures, or yes, I'm trying cannabis to treat sleep or other symptoms. And we know the endocannabinoid system is involved with dozens of physiological and psychological processes, from body temperature regulation to mood to anxiety to sleep. So did you spend much time in that you could speak even at a high level to what women might be interested in knowing about cannabis and menopause?
Yeah, so I have kind of researched quite a lot in cannabinoids, and some of the work I still do now is in cannabinoids and looking at how different cannabinoids can be effective. And of course, it makes a lot of sense that we've seen that argument go forward, because particularly in the States, the availability of these substances between different states obviously varying, but is much more available, and you can in certain places just go and buy these things and try them. And in terms of when we think about things like menopause and what we might be trying to address here, a lot of that symptomology that we see that really does affect women most, which is sort of things around anxiety and mood and sleep, we know that there is good signals there from these cannabinoids in order for them to be effective. But I think further than that, one of the things that we know, if we take, for instance, CBD, cannabidiol, which is the non-psychoactive component of cannabis, well, for instance, we know that actually it works as a very powerful anti-inflammatory. And one thing that we know is, but an issue within menopause when we lose that anti-inflammatory effects of estrogen, we often can start to get sort of symptomology around that. And so it's very plausible that using something like CBD could be very useful for helping in an anti-inflammatory way within the body, within women during menopause. Now, taking it back to THC and looking at the psychoactive component, now obviously there are issues around that and ideas of intoxication and using these substances during the day and while we might be driving or anything. And of course, I would caution against that. But there's also, good evidence, particularly when we look at perhaps not in menopausal women, but one thing I've definitely seen within menstruating women, really women choosing to engage with their cannabis use at different levels at different times of when they have different hormonal profiles. Because, for instance, we know that THC can be very useful for helping us to deal with certain aspects of pain. And again, that could be very useful in menopausal women when we get issues with, chronic pain that can happen around that time. And THC may very well be useful in dealing with that.
Yeah, and they do work synergistically, right? I did a book on CBD, it's years now, 2020, and many of the experts were saying, because CBD itself was very hot at that time, people were just, you could buy it at a gas station, it was everywhere. People were like, this is the new thing. And my understanding of it was that it worked a bit better in its natural state with some THC.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one thing I, would say. And when we look to take any kind of cannabinoid-based concoction that contains both the psychoactive components like THC and CBD, that we look for well-balanced combinations. When we look at the plant and we look at what the plant looked like 20 years ago, there's much more of a balanced ratio between THC and CBD. And where we look at what's happened now, particularly, unfortunately, in a lot of the commercial American markets, we see that the THC levels have been artificially enhanced because it gives you more of a high feeling, and then people feel they're getting more value for their money or something. But when we actually take that plant and we apply it in a clinical setting where we're able to view what's happening within the brain at the time, we do exactly see this sort of yin and yang like interaction that takes place between THC and CBD, where CBD really modulates some of those psychomimetic effects. So some of the anxiety-like effects that can occur from THC. And furthermore, we also see that some of the effects from THC that have been associated with more negative things, like, for instance, development of psychosis, CBD can actually work as an antipsychotic. So it's almost a neuroprotective against some of the harmful effects we can see from THC. And again, we even see trials where CBD is used to help people who have developed cannabis use disorders. So, that's another reason, I think cannabis can be very useful and it can be very good used, a little bit like a glass of wine can be very good, right? A glass of wine can be very good, a bottle of wine maybe not so good. And we see that CBD really helps to mitigate some of the addictive properties of THC.
Yeah, and speaking personally, when I was in perimenopause and I was having like really bad anxiety attacks in the middle of the night that would keep me up for an hour, maybe two, I started using, and that's before I knew that this was hormonally driven and perimenopause driven. I was like 46 at the time. I started using a CBD THC product that helped an awful lot. And there's just a learning curve with all of it that I think that when people, and I'm going to say women, that's our audience, get into it, it can be intimidating and super confusing. Like you mentioned a glass of wine. Most of us know if I have a glass of whiskey, that's going to have some effect that a light beer is not going to have, that a glass of wine will have another effect. And if you drink any alcohol at all, you sort of get to understand the landscape. But when you go into cannabis, holy crap, you you don't understand the landscape because there's all these ratios and strengths and percentages. And if you don't know sativa and indica and all these hybrids, and if you don't know what you're getting into, it can be kind of an unpleasant journey. Yeah, I have taken, you can take and you can use some of these products. I have a tincture. There's no universe I'm high with this at all. It's got so little THC. It's just, am I a little calmer? Sure, but I am not high. There's no head high. There's nothing going on. And my father has started. He's 87. He's got pain. And he's like, this is the only thing that helps me with my pain, but I don't like that stuff that makes me want to just sit on the couch. Right. So
Mhm.
it's just this whole, I think we get this idea that it's one thing, or we smell the skunky weed in the park and we're like, I don't want that. But it's just so many, it's a very rich, diverse, complicated landscape. And it's best if you go into it with some education.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, when the cannabis market really exploded, particularly in the US, it's kind of a bit broified, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
we go to a head shop, it's just full of like bro stoners who, just want to tell you like how high you can get. And luckily what we have now seen, and there are a number of, more female-led brands out there that are trying to address this issue where they're looking for combinations, and we've just talked about THC and CBD. Now, there are over 150 cannabinoids that we, know of. And there are companies that are looking at, what is the perfect combination of those specifically for women in menopause, for instance. And there are those options out there, but how much those are turning up on the shelf of your local head shop, is not so easy. But there are now physicians who are really trying to be quite specific about cannabis use in women, and understanding what those correct ratios are and what is the right way to use these substances. But again, it's one of those ways of, how do you meet people where they're at, people who've never used these kind of substances, with a product that kind of feels like it's safe to use, feels like they have some kind of control over the dosing. And I think, we say that about the cannabis world. I mean, that applies the same, if not more, when we talk about the psychedelic world. And that's one of the things that I really want to ensure that I'm able to do with Histelica. And luckily, we do see it a little bit more in the psychedelic world, but people creating an environment where women feel they can turn up and advocate for themselves, because that's what this really is all about at the moment, particularly with plant medicines. It's very much an individual experience and very much an individual choice to engage with these substances until we see them licensed potentially in the future and you're getting them through, your usual healthcare provider.
Before we move on to psychedelics, I realize I dove, maybe for some of the audience, straight into the deeper end of the pool with the endocannabinoid system, when many people might not even know, because they didn't spend a year writing a book on CBD, that there is an endocannabinoid system, that we naturally make some of these. So can you just talk briefly about what that system is, and if there are any sex differences in it? And if that changes, and this might be too much of a question, but I just read a paper in BMC yesterday. It was an editorial saying maybe at menopause we need to adjust our prescription dosage of medicines we're taking, because first pass metabolism in the liver, and we might not be metabolizing things the same way. And I thought, oh, that probably affects a lot of things in our life. So let's talk endocannabinoid system first, and then sort of transition to the sex differences and maybe lifespan
Yeah,
differences.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So the endocannabinoid system, the plant named the system because we found out about the plant first, which is kind of quite how
That's
recently
funny.
we realized that this whole system exists. But essentially, it's a system that is within throughout our whole body. There's a high percentage of receptors that occur in the brain, but it's actually through all of our peripheral tissues as well. And essentially, it's a regulatory system, and we create our own endogenous cannabinoids. So, small proteins that look a lot like CBD and THC that we see in the cannabis plant. And we produce them. And essentially, what the endocannabinoid system does is it works to kind of regulate other systems. So within the brain, what that looks like is it helps to kind of modulate activity, so we don't see things like overexcitation that could lead to things like neuronal damage. Now, that's extremely important at critical periods like adolescence, when our brain is going through this very important transformative phase. But then for the rest of our lives, this endocannabinoid system is there and able to regulate things like functioning within our brain. But we also know that there's a huge component of the endocannabinoid system that's involved in things like our immune response, our inflammatory response to things. So this system, as I say, is there. And when we take things like cannabis, we are essentially putting an exogenous, an external version of these small peptides into our bodies that then go in and work on this system. Now, these different cannabinoids kind of bind in different ways to the receptors. So THC and CBD are doing slightly different things, but they are essentially using this system as a way to affect, be it the way that our brain is firing, the way that a particular immune cell is responding to something. So that's kind of the system and how it works. Now, in terms of our different female responses that we have to these things, I can completely agree with you what you said there in terms of thinking about different doses that we might want to take. And we certainly see that women do report kind of differing effects of feeling of high when they are at different hormonal stages. Now, we don't have good enough research to kind of point to specifically to why that might be. But to your final point around looking at the levels of drugs we take and whether we should change them, I mean, absolutely. Even throughout menstrual cycle changes, even within that 28-day period, the pharmacokinetics, the way that drugs are broken down within our bodies changes. So when we move through menopause, a dose of painkillers that might have been appropriate before most certainly will be different after. And we must get better at understanding what that is, and must get better at it being common practice, that we kind of, as I say, allow people, allow women to have this more personalized way of kind of titrating themselves, particularly when we're thinking about perimenopause, right? When we've got this fluctuation hormones going on during that time, to have people understand you might need more painkillers at this time. You know, we have to fight hard enough to get painkillers in the first place. You know, getting the right dose to match our body's ability to break them down at that time is extremely important. And I think there's no reason why that wouldn't be different with things like cannabis and psychedelics. You know, for instance, I know we're going to come on and talk about psychedelics in a moment, but the dose of psychedelics that postmenopausal women might need to take compared to premenopausal women, we know is more than likely going to be different because of that lack of estrogen, because of that effect on the receptor systems that the psychedelics are going to go and bind to.
Wow. So let's move on to psychedelics. So I saw you talking at a microdosing webinar, as I mentioned, which microdosing is the thing now. I know many people who do it, and it's basically not taking a dose where you're tripping, right? I mean, is that
Yeah.
fair?
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of debate out there on like exactly the definition of microdosing. You know, one of the things that's always been said is a sub-perceptual dose, so you're not able to tell. But actually, what we're really talking about is a sub-hallucinogenic dose. So you might have some feelings that something is a little different, but you're not tripping. You know, you're not
Yeah.
having foreign hallucinations. You know, you're still able to focus on tasks. You're still able to be in your everyday life without kind of having interruptions from the effect of the psychedelic.
Yeah, without talking to the toaster.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Or seeing the curtains
I-
melt on the wall.
Not that I've ever talked to the toaster. Anyway, we don't need to make this about me. What would be the benefit of psychedelics? And that's a broad category itself, right? Like when I talked to Rebecca about her experience, she had both MDMA and psilocybin
Mhm.
assisted therapy, and those were two very different experiences for her. So when we're using this broad brush of psychedelics, where are you painting mostly, I guess?
Yeah, so I mean, exactly right. Often when I'm talking about psychedelics, I'm referring to what I would call classic psychedelics. So psychedelics that are primarily binding to the 5-HT2A receptor, which is one of the primary receptors within our serotonergic system. And the serotonergic system is the neurotransmitter system in our brain that really helps with mood and how we're kind of feeling and motivation and things like that. But MDMA, you know, also works through the serotonergic system, although it does not bind to this specific receptor, and the felt effects are less trippy, as it were, and more about kind of feelings of empathy and kind of connection, and as opposed to the curtains melting down the wall. But both, you know, MDMA and psychedelic, classic psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, DMT can be extremely useful, I think, for women. And I guess to touch on the area where I think that they both can be useful, and talking about larger doses of psychedelics, because we wouldn't usually think about microdosing something like MDMA. We would normally take a dose that is a felt effect, where we have a period of time where we're under the influence, as we might do with a large dose of psilocybin, be that in the Amazon jungle, at a retreat in Jamaica, or in a clinical trial, as are ongoing, over 100 clinical trials currently ongoing with psilocybin. And in that it is as much about the experience in that time, the ability for one to kind of have this introspective reflection on a variety of things. And these things really are incredible internal amplifiers around what we're thinking in our bodies. And that experience being a huge part of the therapeutic effect. And particularly when we talk about, women in menopause, a lot of what, seems to be part of people's kind of struggle as they move through this phase is not just the kind of felt physical effect, but it's also the kind of known mental kind of effects of moving through this phase of, going from being fertile to no longer able to have to reproduce. And so within that experience, many women that go through it who are in, perimenopause and menopause describe that they have these experiences that really allow them to come to terms with that process, to basically accept they're moving into a new phase. This sort of, the second spring of life, as they say in parts of Asia, right? So there's that huge benefit of it, this kind of psychological experience, this ability to kind of interrogate and accept us moving from one phase to another. But I also believe that there is incredibly interesting and important mechanistic effects that happen both at the macro dose, the big dose, and in what we've described here, which is the microdose. Now, that is around the idea that these substances are going in, and yes, they're kind of triggering the serotonergic system and giving us that little boost of serotonin and allowing for, increased connectivity between different parts of our brain, which improves things like our cognitive functioning, our executive functioning, our creative abilities. But we also know that it acts very powerfully to reduce anxiety, to reduce depression. We see incredible results with people with post-traumatic stress disorder, for instance, and being able to really overcome these different disorders. And then the final mechanism I would point to that, in my mind, is the most exciting for women in menopause is the idea that what then happens after we've had that initial binding of the substance, that initial mechanistic action within the serotonergic system and at various other receptors in the brain, is we see our brain become more plastic. Our brain kind of get this boost of vitality in terms of it reduces inflammation. It starts to produce, to grow and to produce new transcriptions of the genes, which allow for more branching within neurons so that we can make more connections within our brain. Now, why is that important? Well, what happens in menopause? We lose estrogen. What happens when we lose estrogen? We lose plasticity. We increase inflammation. We reduce the amount of that neurogenesis that's going on. So we are seeing mechanisms within psychedelics that are all, very much mirroring those mechanisms of estrogen. And therefore, we may be starting to kind of be able to replace some of that action of estrogen. But, in a best case scenario, psychedelics are currently being investigated for treatment of things like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. Well, we know that Alzheimer's vastly affects women. Why does it vastly affect women? Because of that loss of estrogen. So are we seeing a mechanism in psychedelics that could be neuroprotective for perimenopausal and menopausal women? Sorry, that was a lot.
No, it was amazing. So while you were talking, all I could think of is I'm not sure if you saw two things. One, there was a New York Times piece that actually did a animation of the brain on psilocybin, showing a lot of what you were talking about, that plasticity that happens afterwards. It was an incredible piece. I'll link it in the show notes. And Dr. Lisa Mosconi's seminal work where she did brain scans on women through the menopause transition, showing the physical brain changes, the loss of connectivity and some of the energetics and all of that. And I'm like, whoa, if we could put that all together, which you you just did in what you explained, that's some fascinating territory.
Yeah, absolutely. And really in an area where we currently don't have great answers. Obviously HRT is coming a long way and we're past the days of thinking it was the bogeyman, right? And we're able to kind of get proper rigorous science and better access to it. But HRT is not appropriate for everyone. HRT might not be appropriate for women past a certain age. But we still want to be able to have those positive effects in the same way that we would with estrogen.
And I've done a number of shows where we talk about the research that shows how trauma amplifies menopause, exacerbates any symptoms of menopause, past trauma, adverse
Mhm.
childhood experiences, all of it
Mhm.
lead to a more difficult
Mhm.
menopause. And it makes sense to me when you're talking that there could be something very, very healing there, for lack of a better word, that could allow people, because that, again, I'm going to keep referring to Rebecca's experience because it was so pivotal. It allowed her, she had a lot of past trauma. She lost her dad in the Vietnam War, right, when she was 3. Yeah, she's a lot of things went on in her life, and she would, all that stuff is still in you, and when you have that loss of hormones at this midlife period, and this midlife period is so hard, and there's more stress, and it's harder to control that stress, all that trauma just comes to the surface and makes everything that much more difficult. And as she said, it allowed her to just strip off all these layers and look at it sort of objectively, and just address stuff that she just had never addressed. And it's
Yeah.
changed her. It has fundamentally changed her.
I mean, I do not say it lightly when I say that these are unbelievably impactful and profound substances. And so many of the people that I have worked with over the years using psychedelics describe these as some of the most profound experiences of their lives. And that's why I sort of say these things are amazing, but treat them with respect. Treat yourself with the respect when going into using them, be it in a microdosing or a large dose way, but both deserve that kind of respect. But yeah, in terms of how we deal with trauma, and I'm fascinated with the differences between how men and women process trauma and how men and women's bodies store trauma differently. And PTSD is twice as common in women as in men.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and what are the reasons for that, right? But actually, if we look at when people do get PTSD, we can see that PTSD develops at different rates depending on where they are in their menstrual cycle, right? So what hormonal profile you have at the time of the trauma affects the way that the brain consolidates traumatic memories. So we know that that is impactful in that regard. That's going to cause this difference. But we also know that when we look at particularly start thinking about things like neurodivergence, like ADHD and things, how that fluctuates in terms of our hormonal profile. And so much of that is, reflecting of how our brain is working so differently at different times. And so once we move into that, late perimenopause, menopause state where we have this consistent low level of estrogen and also progesterone, it's almost like, we don't have the mask anymore. We don't have the kind of fuel that comes from those different hormones to just keep powering through, to just keep shutting the trauma down and ignoring it. And so once we move into those phases, often you see it bubbling up, and it's not that it wasn't there before, it's just that you had the ability to just keep pushing through it. Now, psychedelics and their ability to heal trauma is utterly profound. I've done a lot of work with military veterans working with psychedelics and seen things that have been utterly remarkable in terms of, men who've tried 15 years of conventional treatments and within one evening have managed to address the fact that this was all quite specifically due to an event that happened often in their childhood, and enabled in their ability to reframe that within their psyche, they're able to move forward through those traumas. And I think that that's potentially even more the case when we come to women, because we know that women are so good at internalizing a lot of these traumas. So many of these traumas are in the form of microaggressions that continuously happen to us over our lives. And I think once we hit that menopausal state, we are a bit out of gas to deal with the BS anymore. And it is a perfect time for us to say, I need to go and do this for me, and do that inner work and find those places where trauma is stored, and be able to kind of use these substances to address it on these very fundamental psychological levels. Just to kind of mention something, a bit more around why I think it's so important in women is, one thing we also know is that things like childhood trauma and adverse events are highly associated with the development of autoimmune disorders. 80% of autoimmune disorders occur in women, right? Now, why is that? Okay, and I believe that's evidence to what I said previous, that women are internalizing traumas on a much higher level. And I think once we get past that menopausal state, when we have those traumas and those internal conflicts, and we just keep trying to push through, that's where we start to see physical illness come out. That's when we start to see our bodies almost start attacking themselves. And so by taking psychedelics and going and addressing this on a psychological level, we're potentially preventing ourselves from falling into physical ill health.
Yeah, and it also gives women a sense of agency. As you were speaking, I was thinking about the only thing I knew about menopause growing up is my nana went quote unquote crazy during during menopause. That's what everybody in the family said. Oh, your nana. I mean, she was always fragile in her mental state, but she did become paranoid, leaving notes around the house for people that she thought were breaking into the house to steal things out of the fridge. It was bleak. And we used to just medicate women. Like we used to just, oh, take this sedative. How many women got sedatives throughout 50s, 60s? I mean, that was just the thing. Like, oh,
Yeah,
you're just stressed,
therapy.
you can't deal. You're still doing it. My mom had a massive heart attack because they didn't treat her. They just said, oh, you're just stressed, and gave her tranquilizers
Yeah,
when she was
absolutely.
having heart disease.
Absolutely. And it's one of the things I don't think we talk about, enough. I told you how I started my research way back then in cannabis. I was really researching an awful lot around psychosis and the development of psychosis. And when we talk about psychosis and we think about psychosis, we always kind of usually are thinking of young men, right? That's the usual profile of someone with psychosis. But actually, once you get over 30, like the age of 30, it's much more likely for psychosis to occur in women. And when we transition through menopause, there's a huge increase in the risk of the development of psychosis. And many women don't get taught this. And again, it's that loss of estrogen. It's that loss of the neuroprotective effect. And that's where we can think about things like CBD potentially being very useful, because it has these antipsychotic effects. And where we do see women having these sort of increased psychomimetic effects, increase in, paranoia and delusional thought patterns and things like that. Well, can we use something like CBD to try and manage that? Because we know why it's happening. It's happening because we've lost that estrogen effect, and that is causing this dysregulation to occur in our brain functioning.
And the big elephant in the room that we haven't talked about is that a lot of this research is kind of stalled out because of the whole Schedule 1 thing, right? Because all of what we're talking about is still illegal.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're certainly seeing that barrier being crossed in the fact that we've now got, this. One of the things that always amuses me, particularly in women's health, is when people try and call it a niche area, right? There is a huge market out there.
51% of the population.
Exactly.
That's a niche, small.
Shareholders.
What are you even talking about?
Exactly. And so, there's this huge, huge market there, particularly in women's health, definitely in mental health, in order for there to be new and effective treatments developed. And so we've seen a huge advent in psychedelic science and in psychedelic biotech. And as I said earlier, over 100 clinical trials going on. just with psilocybin alone, looking at how we can develop this into a regulated drug product. And so, once you kind of got a regulated drug product, it being a Schedule 1 substance doesn't matter so much because you are treating it as a pharmaceutical agent. But when it comes to sort of like what I'm doing, which is a bit more on an academic level, then it's very difficult. When you're trying to do any kind of grassroots research, it's crazy what you have to do, in terms of getting the licensing and the security around the drug substance within your lab, even though you could just go onto a street corner and buy 5 packs of much for literally 1% of the price you've paid for the clinical trial substance, you still require the police to come and check you've bolted the safe to the floor. So it has been very restrictive in that sense. But that's where I think there are some extremely interesting workarounds. One of the most interesting things about psychedelic substances is that we have them existing in this clinical development model where we've got a number of drug candidates that are going through clinical trials, as every drug that gets licensed does. But on the other hand, we've got these substances existing as they have existed for hundreds of years in the wild, where
Yeah.
you've millions of people taking them every year. And some of that use is not in a responsible way, right? And we see it in recreational markets and getting kind of promoted in a way that isn't safe. But a lot of that use is intentional. It's, kind of done in a medicinal way where people are, as I say, advocating for themselves and making those choices to go to retreat sites or to go to places like Colorado where you can buy these substances and use them, with protocols that have been developed by psychonauts who are, they're not clinicians, they're not, prescribers in any way, but through years of personal use and conversations with the community who have been using it, they've been able to come up with protocols. Now, for me, that's great because that's a huge, huge bunch of knowledge that exists out in the wild, where I think we can interrogate what people are doing and choosing to do in their lives to learn so much without having to pay all the money to develop a clinical trial and have that kind of secured mechanism. Now, that will be needed in the end. Of course, that will be needed in the end. And that's what the FDA will want to see and every regulator around the world will need to see. But I think for where we are now, where the cart has gone so far ahead of the horse, asking the community, how are you engaging with these substances? What are you finding? Allows us to get quickly ahead of A, where this might be effective, but B, and most importantly, how can we do this safely? How can we advise people safely on how to engage in stuff that we actually think might be extremely beneficial, particularly, as I say, in areas like women's healthcare where we have such a lack of good options.
If you were to gaze into your crystal ball, where do you see all this going in the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, I think within the next 3 years, we'll certainly have a licensed medicine, most likely for treatment-resistant depression. Will be the first one, I believe, and maybe PTSD with MDMA in the US for sure, if not in Europe. We already see in Australia that you can have off-label prescribing for MDMA and psilocybin, so it's already kind of in their healthcare service, if not in a formal license way. So we're definitely going to start to see this available from your physician if you have a diagnosis for this particular disorder. But I think that we need to kind of pay respect to the fact that there's a whole market out there that I think will start to look more and more like what the recreational cannabis market looks like now. But I just hope it's done with a lot more care and precision. And within that, I mean structured programs for when people are taking large doses, so that they're properly facilitated, properly prepared, properly integrated throughout that. And perhaps in different states, these microdosing substances being made available, like we've seen with ketamine, for instance, is available now in the US and through the post in a microdosing way. And I think we're going to see that these kind of gray areas appear where people can engage with that stuff. Once we get to 10 years out, I think the regulatory bodies will have had to get fully around this. and understand it more. But what I really hope is that they're going to accept this real world evidence, the millions of people that have been using it, as proof that these substances can be used safely and can be effective without every product available having to be what will be a very expensive pharmaceutical drug product.
Right, right. Yeah, I had a friend of mine who I used to do a podcast with. Ketamine assisted therapy saved his life, hands down. He had clinical terrible depression his whole life, and it was transformative. I mean, it changed everything for him.
Oh, it really is. I mean, it is the fastest acting antidepressant we know of. And given it's what we have available to us right now, it's a wonderful thing to have in the toolbox, particularly where you've got people who really are in a very critical position, because SSRIs are very hit and miss if they work at all, and they take several weeks to kick in if they do. Whereas ketamine, it's almost instant in terms of that turnaround. But with ketamine in itself, it has its own kind of issues. We've already seen within that market where it has been kind of allowed out in a clinical way, people trying to bend the rules, and unfortunately, sad instances happening with it. And that's why I'm very cautious to say with people with any drugs, these are extremely powerful substances that are going to affect your ability to, turn up in the world in any moment. So you need to be safe, as safe as you possibly can. That's my key word with any psychedelic uses. Are you safe in doing this? Yeah. So I hope that we kind of see that playing out more. And in that, respect to the kind of process of it. One of the most interesting things about psychedelics, and when we look at it from an academic point of view, and we really try and cut it down to, okay, what is it? What is the secret sauce? What is the thing that's flicking the switch to make the person get better? And no matter how many ways we try and interrogate it, when we talk about, large doses of psychedelics, but also in the microdosing sense, there is this sense of somewhat kind of divine guidance or spiritual aspect or something beyond us that seems to be involved in some way, and kind of paying the right amount of respect to that, be you religious or not, I think is extremely important for anybody's journey with any psychedelic.
Yeah, and I should be very clear to note that none of the people that I have mentioned did this on their own. They did a lot of research and found practitioners, the right set and setting, guided treatment, guided therapy, guided sessions, and I would never be like, just go out and try this on your own and see what happens. Um, what we haven't talked really, and as we come up to the top of the hour, what should people be cautious of if they are interested in, going down these avenues? Like, what should women be? I mean, set and setting and finding the right avenues, I imagine, are very, very, very important.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, what are you going to take? Where has it come from? Are you sure you kind of know that it is what you say it is? And, unfortunately, I know, particularly in the States, substances not being what you think they are is a very, very dangerous situation with things like fentanyl, for instance, being available. And that's the problem with having these kept in these very tightly regulated and very illegal states, is that you have to go via the black market route often to procure the substance. So that's the first place to start. The second place, as I say, is who are you doing it with? Do you trust this person? I always think about when you're going to go through a large psychedelic journey, it's a little bit like you're going to give birth in some way. Would you have this person help you give birth? Like, kind of
That's a great, that's a
help
high
you build
bar,
that
and that's
trust.
good. Yeah.
Would you, if you were stuck and I've got to give birth and this person's going to be the person who's in the room with me, is that something that you would want? Because that's the level that you need someone to be able to hold you and hold the space for you. And so really asking yourself the question, do I trust this person? Do I feel safe with this person? And does this person have the skill set that if I freak out, they're going to be able to stay calm, they're going to know what to do? And there are people who have been training in this for many, many, many years, be that through indigenous cultures, be that through more Western practices, be those clinical psychologists in clinical trials. There is a wide breadth and people available, in the States who can assist you with this, who can help you and be facilitators for you. But, maybe it's somebody that you know and trust very well already that you think would be appropriate for it. But once you've kind of got that, the substance and who you would do it with, you do need to ask yourself the questions of, is this right for me? There are some people that psychedelic substances are perhaps not the right thing for. There are various drugs that we might be taking that can interact with psychedelics. And we are at the earlier stages of really exploring what they are. So if you're taking a lot of other pharmaceutical medicines, you might need to really consider whether that's appropriate that you do them alongside a psychedelic. Another thing that we have to consider is it safe for certain people who have certain conditions? One of which is psychotic disorders. If you've had a psychotic episode, maybe something like a diagnosis of schizophrenia even, then we wouldn't recommend that you take these, because there have been instances where people have tipped into psychosis. I know we spoke a little about women having these higher risks for psychosis during menopause. Well, if you are someone who starts experiencing, quite strong psychedelic experiences, psychotic experiences, I wouldn't recommend that you try to treat that with psychedelics. Maybe try, as I say, cannabidiol, for instance, which we know has antipsychotic properties. But another one is cardiovascular risk. Women have a huge spike of cardiovascular risk once they move into menopause. One of the other receptors that psychedelics work on is the 5-HT2B receptor. Now, that receptor is very highly present in the heart. And we know that there is an increase in blood pressure and an increased pressure on our cardiovascular system when we take psychedelics. So if you are at a high risk of having a heart attack, maybe don't take a large dose of psychedelics. And there are these incredible medical screeners that are available out there that can take you through all of your medical history and really give you that confidence. But the final thing that, I want to say that you might want to think about before is what is going to come up for you. You may have been very good, as I say, of masking those traumas, of getting rid of whatever it is in your past and not looking at it. When you are under these substances, you will not be able to choose what you are going to address. The medicine, as we call it, will often tell you or bring to you what it is within your psyche that is that sticking point, whether you've been able to turn away from it or not prior to that. And so this kind of check up from the neck up, as someone once told me, to sit with yourself and say, where am I mentally? Where could this take me? And not to say that just because you have something in your past that might be scary, you shouldn't go and look at it. I think you probably should, but be prepared for it. Do the preparation. Understand that this isn't going to be, maybe you will take a psychedelic and you will find yourself skipping around the garden, having the best afternoon of your life, but maybe you will be facing some of the most troublesome things that you have ever known. And you need to be prepared for both of those things to happen.
Thank you so much, Grace, for sharing yourself. I could talk to you for hours, but I really appreciate your wisdom and your eloquence and your curiosity about all of this. I think the whole area is fascinating. I'm really excited to see where it all goes.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. And that's why as I say, I'm so excited to have had the kind of I don't know, undue military confidence, I guess, to push forward and say, hang on, we need to make sure that women and women's biology gets its own special focus as we develop these drugs, because I think that there is a safeguarding thing there, but B, just incredible potential. And hopefully myself and Histelica and all of the incredible researchers who are working in this area will, in the next 3 to 5 to 10 years, start to bring these things in ways that women can really access them and get that benefit because, we all deserve to live happier, healthier lives, right?
100%. Thank you again so much. I will keep track of you and your work at Histelica. I'll drop it into the show notes so people can check you out. I appreciate you. Thank you for joining us on the show.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, that's our show. Come on back next week when I sit down with Dr. Tara Shirazian to talk all about fibroids and uterine health. And boy, this is a show, honest to God, I should have done it 5 years ago. But anyway, we're here now. She came to my attention after she performed surgery on Venus Williams for the fibroids that she has been suffering with, forever. And this is one of those shows that, I don't know, it left me both very angry for the terrible care that women have gotten for so very long, and also just very grateful for women like Tara and Venus who are working to change things for the better. So come on back for that one. And until then, as always, stay feisty. You've been listening to Hit Play, Not Pause, a feisty menopause podcast for active, performance-minded women. I'm your host, Celine Yeager. The show is edited and produced by the strong, talented, and amazing women at Live Feisty Media. Follow us on social media at Feisty Menopause. And please help us spread the word. Screenshot and share this episode on your social media channels with the tag @FeistyMenopause. Share the show with your friends. And please subscribe, like, review, and rate this show wherever you get your podcasts. Word of mouth and good reviews make it easier for other listeners to find. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay feisty.